Hi, my name is Lindel Hart. I'm the yoga teacher at Deerfield Academy, and I also teach at Community Yoga in Greenfield, Massachusetts. Today I'm going to give you a short mini vinyasa that you can practice on your own, anytime, using the video to help you, or just doing it on your own once you've learned it. The primary focus is going to be the transition from downward dog to plank to Chaturanga Dandasana, upward dog, and back into downward dog. This is a key component in a lot of Vinyasa or flow classes. And there are a lot of points to that kind of get missed when you're doing a flow, because the emphasis is on flowing, and so the alignment sort of falls apart a little bit, or certain aspects of it get ignored. But it's really important to maintain that connection to the poses and the transitions between them so that you regulate your energy, your breath, and you keep your alignment intact. So, with that in mind, I'd like you to come to stand in Tadasana, mountain pose. Take a deep breath in, bring your arms overhead, and as you exhale, swan dive forward. That means leading with the heart, lengthening the spine, and then folding forward. From this position, step your left foot back into a lunge, and then step your right foot back and you come into plank pose. Now, plank is the first thing that I find usually goes a little awry here, because most of the work tends to land in someone's shoulders, when in reality the work is in the legs and in the core. So in your plank position, you want to make sure you're pressing strongly through the heels, pressing down into the heels of your hands so your shoulders are floating upward, and keeping your navel lifted so that you keep your core engaged. Lifting from the navel, press back into downward facing dog. At any point that you're doing downward dog, if you need to put a little bend in your knees, do that, because that will make it easier to lift the tailbone and open the shoulders more. Creates a little more length to the spine. All right, so let's inhale, come forward into plank, exhale to Chaturanga, lift into upward dog, and exhale to downward dog. Good. Take a breath. Exhale. Bring your knees down. Sit back for a moment. That is the basic sequence that we're going to focus on. Now, when you come from downward dog to plank, that's pretty easy to do. You're just sliding forward. But sometimes what happens is you'll come from downward dog into plank, and then you're anticipating coming down into Chaturanga, and it starts to happen here in the hips. You're going to potentially put too much pressure in the lower back if you do that. So when you come forward from downward dog into plank, just let your hips come down in line between your shoulders and your ankles. Let's try going back and forth between those two positions. So starting in downward dog, come forward to plank, bring your shoulders right above your wrists, and then lift your navel, come back to downward dog. Inhale forward, exhale back. All you're doing is hinging between these two poses. And let's do one more time, coming forward, and then pressing back. Go ahead and release your knees down to the floor. Sit back for just a moment. Now the next component is Chaturanga Dandasana. And Chaturanga is something that intimidates a lot of people. But it shouldn't, or it doesn't need to. Because if you're keeping your legs engaged and you're keeping your core engaged, your transition from plank to Chaturanga is fairly straightforward. Now, the other thing to remember is that your elbows stay in place above your wrists, and they bend to a 90-degree angle, okay? So the only way that can happen is if you glide forward. If your focus is going from plank to chaturanga and you think, oh, I have to go down, something like this is going to happen. And then you're going to collapse to the floor. Imagine that there's a cushion of air underneath your body, and it's there to support you as you come down. So I want to start with just some awareness of the feet. We're going to come into plank, and all we're going to do is rock forward and back. Now, the whole time you want to make sure your navel is pulling up into the interior of the body so your core stays engaged. And you just rock back and forth. Good. Bring your knees down and sit back. The other thing that happens when you do this transition from plank to chaturanga and eventually into upward dog is that you're actually rolling over the tips of your toes. Now that sounds kind of scary for a lot of people who've never done that before, but I'm telling you that there is very little weight in your toes. The weight is distributed through your whole body as long as you're engaging your legs and keeping your core engaged. So we're going to do a little mini practice that I hope will get you ready for that transition of rolling over the toes. So let's come to hands and knees. Knees about hip width apart. Feet the same distance apart as your knees, so your legs are parallel. You sit back in Vajrasana, thunderbolt pose. Bring your hands to the floor. They're going to be approximately shoulder width apart with the heels of your hands just in front of the knees. As you press down into your hands, press down into the tops of your feet and lift your knees 2 or 3 inches off the floor. And then lower down. This lift is going to get increasingly higher, and it's going to come from your core muscles, your abdominals, so you have to keep the navel pulling in. Now we're going to do that once more, and we're going to come up a little higher. So let the body start to shift forward, just like you did from plank to, a minute ago. You're just gliding forward. And as you come forward a few inches, the hips are going to lift away from your heels, press down into the tops of your feet, and lift your knees a little higher, maybe a foot off the floor. And then lower down and sit back. I'm going to do it from the side because I want you to see what's happening as we get a little more into this. Same thing. You start here. You bring your hands forward. Your hands are going to take a little more weight each time you do this. And you're going to lift a little higher from your core. So you come forward again. You press into the hands and the feet. And you lift the knees way up. And then release down. Come back to sit. Fourth and final time we're going to do this is where you start to roll over the toes. Now I'd like you to watch and just focus on my feet for a minute. When you come up, you simply roll over the toes. And then you come back, lifting the heels, letting the weight come forward into your hands. You roll back over the toes and onto the tops of your feet. When you do it, it's going to be a continuous, smooth process. Here we go. I'd like you to try this. So you come forward, lift the hips a little, pressing into the hands and the tops of your feet, lift from your navel and roll over the toes. And then roll back. And roll up. And do this a couple of times. Now, truthfully, you can keep going if you want, or you can take a break. There is so little weight in your toes that you could do a little lift. Now, I'm not saying you have to do this, but just to illustrate the point that there's very little weight in the toes, so you're not going to crush your toes, this is what you could do. And you notice that I landed right on the tops of my feet. But again, because I'm controlling from the core, very little weight. Okay, so how do we use that to start the transition to Chaturanga? It's going to look like this. From your plank, you come forward, or from your downward dog, you come forward into plank, move forward to the tops of your toes as you come to elbow height, roll onto the tops of your feet, and you come up into upward dog. Now, when you come to upward dog, you're not resting your hips on the floor. That's cobra. We're actually lifting the hips a few inches off the floor, thighs and knees floating up, and then you press back into your downward dog. So it's a pretty simple process. And what I'd like to do, just to finish up this little mini practice, is to have you do several rounds of that and focus on breathing smoothly and steadily. Focus on keeping the feet activated and the core activated. And it's just a big loop of movement. There's no real stopping at any point. For instance, here is what it would look like. Inhaling forward through plank, exhaling to Chaturanga, continuing to move into upward dog, and then lifting back into downward dog. All right, so let's do a couple of rounds of that and really focus on just that smooth, continuous movement rather than a pose, a transition, a pose, a transition. It's all just a continuous loop of movement or a continuous transition. So let's do 5 rounds of that together. Starting from hands and knees, step back into plank and lift into downward dog. Try to keep your feet about hip width apart as you do this. Here we go. Inhale forward to plank. Exhale through to Chaturanga. Lift into upward dog. Release back into downward dog. Inhale again into plank. Exhale to Chaturanga. Lift into upward dog. Exhale to downward dog. Inhale to plank. Exhale Chaturanga. Upward dog. Downward dog. Let's do 2 more. Inhale to plank. Chaturanga. Inhale upward dog. Exhale downward dog. Last time. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. And exhale. Good. Bring your knees down. Sit back for just a moment. And let's do one more practice of this. This time we're going to take 2 counts to get to each point. So you start from downward dog, inhaling through a slow count of 2 to plank, but you keep moving, slow count of 2 to Chaturanga, same to upward dog, back to downward dog. And then we're going to do a 3 count. All right, come to hands and knees. Step back into plank and lift into downward dog. Here we go. Inhale 1, 2 to plank. Exhale 1, 2 to Chaturanga. Inhale 1, 2 to upward dog. Exhale 1, 2 to downward dog. Great. 3 counts. So it's elongating the whole transition here. Prepare by taking a breath in and exhaling. And then inhale 1, 2, 3 to plank. Exhale to Chaturanga. 1, 2, 3. Upward dog in 1, 2, 3. Downward dog in 1, 2, and 3. Bring your knees down. Press back into child's pose.
Take a couple of breaths in child's pose. And then slowly slide your hands back and come back to sit. Bring your hands together in Anjali Mudra. Namaste.